Rhonda Casto had everything to live for: a young daughter, a bright future, and dreams of rebuilding her life. But on a cold March afternoon, she walked into the Oregon wilderness with her boyfriend, Steve Nichols, and never came out alive. What happened on that trail that day defied logic, shattered a family, and left behind a mystery so chilling that, even years later, investigators would say the same haunting words: "It's impossible to explain." Rhonda Casto was only 23, but her life seemed to be heading in the right direction. She was young, beautiful, and had once modeled for small agencies in Oregon. Her striking smile and confidence made people gravitate toward her, and those who knew her described her as vibrant and full of energy. When she became a mother, her focus shifted entirely to her baby daughter, whom she adored more than anything. To friends and family, she seemed to be balancing motherhood and life with determination and optimism. Behind that cheerful exterior, however, was a relationship that had quietly turned dark. Her boyfriend, Steve Nichols, was much older and more experienced. He had promised her stability and love, something that sounded perfect to a young woman trying to build a family. In the beginning, things looked promising. Steve had a steady income, a house, and a sense of authority that made Rhonda feel safe. But over time, that sense of safety eroded. Steve became controlling, often telling her where she could go and who she could see. Friends noticed she grew quieter, more hesitant, as if she was constantly weighing her words. Her mother sensed the change too. She later recalled that Rhonda had made an unsettling comment: if anything ever happened to her, Steve would be the one responsible. It sounded like an exaggeration at the time, but it would later become one of the most chilling details of the entire case. Despite the tension, Rhonda stayed. She had a daughter to raise, and she wanted to believe that things could get better. Steve persuaded her to move into his remote house near the Columbia River Gorge, surrounded by forests, cliffs, and miles of wilderness. It was a beautiful area, but also isolated. To some, it was peaceful. To others, it felt like a place you could vanish in without anyone noticing. Rhonda didn't know it yet, but that setting would become the backdrop for her final moments. March 16, 2009, began as an ordinary day. The weather was cool, with low clouds drifting through the gorge. Steve suggested they go hiking on the Eagle Creek Trail, one of Oregon's most scenic but dangerous trails. The path wound through steep cliffs and narrow ledges, where one wrong step could send someone plunging hundreds of feet below. Rhonda agreed to go. Maybe she wanted to reconnect with him, or maybe she just wanted some air. She even posted a cheerful picture of herself before leaving, a photo that radiated life and hope. That photo would soon become evidence, her last known image alive. Later that day, Steve returned home alone. According to him, it was an accident. He told police Rhonda had slipped on the wet trail and fallen into the gorge. Her body was later found at the bottom of a cliff, lifeless and broken. The search team that located her described the scene as heartbreaking. Rhonda's hiking shoes were still on, her phone shattered nearby, and her body lay among the rocks and brush at the base of the drop. When news reached her family, disbelief turned into horror. Rhonda's mother, who had always worried about Steve's temper, immediately suspected something darker than an accident. The pain of losing a daughter was unbearable, but the idea that someone she trusted might be responsible made it even worse. To the rest of the community, it was a shocking tragedy: a young mother, full of potential, gone in an instant. Investigators questioned Steve, and his story seemed too simple. He said Rhonda had been laughing and running ahead when she suddenly lost her footing. He described it as a freak accident, something that could happen to anyone. But the more police listened, the more details felt off. Why hadn't he called for help immediately? Why did he wait before alerting anyone? Why was he so composed when describing the moment he lost the woman he claimed to love? While the official report listed the death as accidental, many people close to Rhonda couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. The trail was dangerous, yes, but Rhonda was an experienced hiker. She wasn't reckless. Friends remembered how cautious she always was when near steep drops or rivers. The more they thought about it, the more they wondered if the fall had been pushed rather than slipped. But at that moment, there was no proof, just grief, confusion, and unanswered questions. Rhonda was gone, leaving behind a daughter too young to understand what had happened and a mother who would spend years fighting for the truth. Steve moved on quietly, living his life as if the past had been buried along with her. Yet something about that day never sat right with anyone who knew her. The accident felt too convenient, too perfectly timed. Rhonda's future had been wide open, plans for school, dreams of traveling, hopes of raising her daughter in a happier home. It all ended on a cliffside with a story that made no sense. And for those who loved her, that was the beginning of a mystery that would haunt them for years. From the very beginning, Steve Nichols' version of events raised more questions than it answered. He told investigators that Rhonda had slipped while running down the trail, laughing moments before she disappeared over the edge. But his calm tone and the inconsistencies in his statements made detectives uneasy. The Eagle Creek Trail was steep, but it wasn't a place where careful hikers simply vanished. The fall site he described didn't match where Rhonda's body was found. Even more troubling, there were no signs that she had struggled to regain her balance or called for help. It was as if she had gone over too suddenly, too completely, to be accidental. When detectives retraced the couple's path that day, they found that Steve's timeline didn't fit. He said they had been hiking for about 40 minutes before the fall, but witnesses later claimed they saw them much closer to the start of the trail. There were also gaps in his story about what happened afterward. Instead of calling for help right away, Steve returned to his car, waited for hours, and only contacted authorities later that evening. He explained that he hadn't had cell service, but police discovered that the area had several spots with strong signal. It was possible he could have called earlier, but he didn't. Investigators began to dig into his past, and what they found painted a troubling picture. Steve Nichols was not the stable, gentle man he appeared to be. He had been married before, and his ex-wife described him as controlling and emotionally manipulative. He often used his charm to get what he wanted, and when challenged, he could become unpredictable. Financially, he was struggling. His business ventures had failed, and he was in debt. So when detectives learned that he had taken out a $1 million life insurance policy on Rhonda just months before her death, they couldn't ignore it. The policy listed him as the sole beneficiary. Rhonda's mother had no idea it existed. When questioned, Steve insisted it was just a precaution for their daughter's future, something any responsible parent would do. But for investigators, it felt like motive, a way to turn tragedy into money. The timing of the policy, combined with Rhonda's death, was too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Rhonda's family also began sharing their suspicions. Her mother revealed that Rhonda had been talking about leaving Steve. She wanted to go back to school, maybe study counseling, and she had started reconnecting with friends who had drifted away. To them, she had seemed hopeful, ready to move forward. But Steve wasn't part of those plans. She had even told a friend that she didn't trust him anymore. That made what happened on the trail even more disturbing. Detectives examined Rhonda's phone records and found something odd. Just before the time of her fall, she had received a text message from Steve. He claimed he hadn't sent anything, but the data showed a message had been sent from his number. Whether it was an accidental ping or something deliberate remained unclear, but it deepened the mystery around the last minutes of her life. Meanwhile, the physical evidence didn't help much. The area was rocky, covered in moss, and open to the elements. Any potential footprints or signs of struggle had been washed away by rain. The autopsy listed her cause of death as blunt force trauma consistent with a fall, but the exact mechanism, whether accidental or forced, couldn't be determined. The only clear detail was that Rhonda's injuries were severe and immediate. As weeks turned into months, the case stalled. Steve was never charged. Without witnesses or physical proof, investigators couldn't prove foul play. Officially, Rhonda's death remained classified as an accident. Unofficially, nearly everyone close to her believed otherwise. In the small Oregon community, whispers started to spread. People questioned Steve's behavior in the days after the tragedy. He didn't seem like a grieving partner. He avoided public vigils and never showed much emotion when talking about Rhonda. Instead, he focused on his insurance claim and custody arrangements for their daughter. To outsiders, it looked as if he was trying to erase her rather than mourn her. Her mother refused to accept it. She began collecting everything: old texts, photos, even Rhonda's notebooks. She spoke to reporters, urging them to keep her daughter's name in the news. Every time she talked about Rhonda, she repeated the same chilling line her daughter once said: "If anything happens to me, Steve did it." Still, no new evidence surfaced. The police eventually closed the investigation, but no one could shake the feeling that justice hadn't been done. The death of Rhonda Casto became another file in a drawer, another mystery without resolution. But time has a way of bringing buried secrets back to light. Years later, one unexpected relationship would change everything. The man suspected of killing Rhonda would soon find himself entangled with someone who knew her better than anyone else: her own sister. And that strange twist would reopen the case that everyone thought was over. Years passed after Rhonda Casto's death, and though the case had faded from the headlines, her mother never stopped searching for answers. She contacted detectives every few months, hoping for a new lead, but there was nothing to report. The investigation had gone cold. Steve Nichols had moved on with his life, raising the daughter he shared with Rhonda and presenting himself as a devoted single father. To the outside world, he seemed calm and collected, but to those who had once known Rhonda, his composure was unsettling. Then, something happened that reignited suspicion. It started quietly, with whispers and rumors that spread through the small Oregon community. People began to notice that Steve was spending a lot of time with someone unexpected: Rhonda's younger sister, Melody. At first, Melody had moved in to help care for her niece, wanting to support the child her sister left behind. But over time, her relationship with Steve became more personal, crossing a line that shocked their family. Within a few years, they were living together as a couple. Rhonda's mother. This was an unbearable betrayal. The man she believed had killed her daughter was now romantically involved with her other child. It created a deep rift within the family, one that would never fully heal. But beyond the emotional devastation, something about the relationship drew the attention of law enforcement. Melody began to share details about Steve's behavior that made detectives reopen the case. According to Melody, Steve often spoke about Rhonda in strange, almost boastful ways. He would recount the day of her death casually, sometimes even joking about it. Once, he hinted that he knew things about the fall that no one else would ever understand. It was an eerie statement that left Melody unsettled. Over time, she began to feel that Steve had manipulated her the same way he had controlled her sister. When their relationship started to deteriorate, she finally went to the police. Her cooperation changed everything. Investigators reopened the case in 2015, more than 6 years after Rhonda's death. The new detective assigned to the file approached it with fresh eyes. He went over every detail: phone records, insurance files, medical reports, and began to see patterns others had missed. Forensic experts re-examined photos from the scene and noticed inconsistencies in how Rhonda's body had landed. Her injuries didn't match the way Steve described her fall. The distribution of trauma on her body suggested she had been pushed or had fallen while struggling, not simply slipped. The investigation also uncovered financial motives that were stronger than before. Steve had not only collected on the life insurance policy, but had also been struggling with debt at the time of Rhonda's death. The money had allowed him to stay afloat. Detectives found emails showing he was under significant financial stress in the months leading up to the incident. Combined with Melody's statements, it started to look like a calculated crime rather than an accident. Then there were the behavioral clues. Steve's decision to start a relationship with his dead girlfriend's sister raised suspicions among investigators about his mindset. It wasn't just inappropriate, it suggested a lack of remorse. Melody described how he would shift blame constantly, claiming Rhonda had been unstable, that she had taken risks on the trail, and that she might have even jumped. Each explanation contradicted the last. It was the kind of story that evolved over time, shaped to fit whatever evidence existed. Detectives brought Steve in for questioning again. This time, his confident demeanor began to crack. He stumbled over small details, changed parts of his earlier testimony, and admitted to arguing with Rhonda before her fall, something he had previously denied. He even said she had been acting crazy that day and implied she might have thrown herself off the cliff out of frustration. But investigators didn't believe him. They had heard too many shifting stories, and every version seemed designed to distance him from responsibility. In March 2015, Steve Nichols was arrested and charged with manslaughter. The community was stunned. After 6 years of silence, it seemed like justice might finally be within reach. News outlets across Oregon picked up the story again, framing it as a tragic mystery that had taken an unexpected turn. To Rhonda's mother felt a sense of relief mixed with dread. She had waited years for this moment, but it also meant reliving the worst chapter of her life. As she sat in the courtroom watching Steve appear in handcuffs for the first time, she said she could feel her daughter's presence. But deep down, she knew the hardest part was still ahead. The prosecution would have to prove that Rhonda's death wasn't an accident, even though there were no eyewitnesses. It would come down to circumstantial evidence, forensic interpretation, and the disturbing words of the man who had once claimed to love her. The case had finally been reopened, but whether it would end in justice or heartbreak was still uncertain. And as the courtroom prepared for trial, one truth began to emerge. The story Steve Nichols had told for years was about to be torn apart piece by piece. The trial of Steve Nichols became one of the most talked about cases in Oregon. It had everything that captured public attention: love, betrayal, greed, and a death that had never made sense. When the charges were finally brought, the courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the benches, notebooks in hand, while television cameras waited outside. For years, Rhonda Casto's family had fought for this day. But as the proceedings began, they realized how fragile justice could be when there were no witnesses and no clear proof of murder. The prosecution built its case carefully. They painted Steve as a manipulative man who saw Rhonda not as a partner, but as a possession. They said that when she began to pull away, when she wanted to go back to school, make friends again, and think about a life without him, he snapped. The life insurance policy became their key argument. It wasn't just a safety net, they said, but a motive. The prosecutor told the jury that Steve planned the hike, led Rhonda to a dangerous part of the trail, and pushed her to her death for money. It was the only way to fix his financial troubles and keep control of the child they shared. To support their theory, they presented new forensic evidence that showed her injuries were inconsistent with a simple slip. A fall from that height should have left her in a different position, and some of the bruising suggested force applied before the fall. Expert witnesses described how her body was found several feet away from the point of descent, almost as if she had been pushed outward. Even the smallest details, her broken phone, the lack of scratches on her hands, hinted that she hadn't been struggling to save herself. The defense fought back with equal determination. They argued that the case was built on speculation, not facts. There were no eyewitnesses, no confession, and no definitive physical proof that Steve had done anything criminal. They painted Rhonda as emotional and unpredictable, saying she might have slipped because she was careless or even jumped on her own. They reminded the jury that the trail was notoriously dangerous, with steep edges, and loose gravel. To them, it was a tragic accident, not a crime. As the trial went on, the tension in the courtroom became suffocating. Friends and family members took the stand, describing Rhonda as a loving mother who would never have risked her life on a narrow cliff. Her mother's testimony was the most powerful moment of all. She told the jury about the night her daughter had looked her in the eye and said, "If something happens to me, Steve did it." The room fell silent. Even the defense attorney paused before responding. Melody, Rhonda's younger sister and Steve's former girlfriend, also testified. Her words were hesitant but damning. She described how Steve had joked about Rhonda's death, how he had once told her that no one would ever prove anything. She talked about his temper, his need for control, and how he turned cold whenever someone questioned him about the past. The defense tried to discredit her, pointing out that she had lived with him and that their relationship ended badly. They accused her of revenge, but the damage to Steve's image had already been done. Despite all the drama and emotion, the jury struggled. The evidence was circumstantial, the story complex. There was enough to suggest guilt, but not enough to remove all doubt. The prosecution's case was strong in motive and suspicion, but weak in proof. The defense relied on logic and the absence of direct evidence, repeating that a tragic fall does not equal a murder. After weeks of testimony and arguments, the verdict finally came. Steve Nichols reached a deal before the jury could decide. He pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of criminally negligent homicide. The judge sentenced him to a few years in prison, far less than what Rhonda's family had hoped for. When the sentence was read, her mother broke down in tears. It felt like justice had slipped away once again. Steve served his time quietly and was released not long after. When reporters tried to speak to him, he maintained his innocence. He said he still loved Rhonda, that the hike was supposed to be a family outing, not the end of her life. But the public didn't believe him. The inconsistencies, the insurance money, and his relationship with Melody had already destroyed any image of innocence he tried to keep. The trial left everyone divided. Some believed Steve was a murderer who had escaped full punishment. Others thought the system had punished a man for being unlikable rather than guilty. For Rhonda's family, the sentence felt hollow. Their daughter was gone, her life reduced to a court case and a handful of unanswered questions. As Steve walked free again, there was no celebration, only silence. The case that had once promised closure ended with more uncertainty. The truth of what really happened on that cold March day still hung in the air, unresolved and haunting. And for those who had followed every twist of the story, it became clear that justice, like Rhonda's final moments, would remain forever out of reaction. More than a decade after Rhonda Casto's fall from the Eagle Creek Trail, her story continues to haunt those who remember her. What happened that cold March afternoon remains clouded in doubt, surrounded by unanswered questions and painful memories. Her family has tried to move on, but the mystery still lingers over them like a shadow. To them, justice was never truly served. The man they believed responsible walked free, his conviction reduced to a lesser charge. His life continuing while Rhonda's ended before it had truly begun. Steve Nichols resumed his quiet existence, avoiding cameras and interviews as much as possible, but his reputation followed him everywhere. Neighbors whispered when they saw him. Reporters occasionally resurfaced the story, and online forums filled with debates about whether he was guilty or not. Some defended him, arguing that the lack of direct evidence proved his innocence. Others were convinced that he had taken advantage of a young woman's trust, manipulated her, and then ended her life when she no longer fit his plans. For Rhonda's mother, the pain never dulled. Every year, she returned to the same spot near the trail, leaving flowers and a small photo of her daughter smiling. She often said the place felt frozen in time, as if the air itself refused to let go of what had happened there. When hikers passed by, few realized they were walking near the site of a tragedy that had torn apart a family and baffled investigators. The rocks, trees, and wind kept their silence. But those who came close said they felt a heaviness, a stillness that made them pause. Rhonda's daughter, who was just an infant when her mother died, grew up surrounded by half-told stories and missing pieces. She asked questions as she got older, about her mother, about the accident, about the man everyone avoided mentioning too long. Each answer was softened, adjusted, made bearable for a child who had already lost too much. As she reached her teenage years, the internet filled in the gaps her family couldn't. She read articles, watched documentaries, and saw the photos of her mother's last day. For her, the truth became both a wound and a legacy she couldn't escape. Detectives who had once worked the case admitted privately that something about it never felt right. The evidence wasn't enough for a murder conviction, but it also didn't fit an accident. It lived in that gray space between explanation and mystery, a place where logic failed. Over time, they re-examined the case files, hoping new technology might reveal what had been missed before. But no matter how many times they went over it, the answers remained the same. No witnesses, no confession, no clear proof of what really happened on that cliff. Every detail seemed to pull in two directions. The trail was slippery that day, but not impossible to navigate. Rhonda was cautious, yet she was with someone she trusted. Steve's story changed, yet it never completely broke apart. It was a puzzle with too many missing pieces, and each new attempt to solve it only led to more questions. The longer it stayed unresolved, the deeper it embedded itself into local folklore. People called it one of Oregon's most haunting unsolved cases. In later years, Steve occasionally appeared in interviews trying to defend himself. He said the public had turned him into a villain, that Rhonda's death had destroyed his life too. He claimed he had loved her, that her fall was a tragedy he could never move past. But every word he spoke seemed to convince more people of his guilt. His demeanor was cold, his explanations rehearsed, his tone detached. To those who believed Rhonda's death was planned, his interviews were just reminders of how easily charm could disguise cruelty for Rhonda's family. The hardest part wasn't the lack of conviction, it was the uncertainty. They lived with the possibility that the truth might never be known, that the answers were buried somewhere on that trail beyond reach. Her mother once said that not knowing was worse than losing her entirely. At least if there had been justice, she could have found peace. Instead, the case remained suspended in time. Impossible to explain, impossible to forget. Every so often, new hikers discover online posts about Rhonda's story before setting out on the Eagle Creek Trail. Some say they can't stop thinking about it as they walk. They imagine her last steps, the quiet of the forest, the weight of what might have been said between her and Steve. When they reach the overlook, they stop for a moment, the wind rushing around them, the drop below stretching endlessly downward. It's there, standing on that edge, that they feel the full weight of her story, a young mother's life cut short, a man's story that never made sense, and a mystery that refuses to die. Rhonda Casto's case remains one of those tragedies that time cannot wash away. Her name still appears in articles, podcasts, and documentaries, each retelling trying to make sense of what truly happened. But the truth may be forever lost to that trail, to the silence of the trees, and the secrets of the man who walked beside her that day. And for everyone who still remembers her, the story ends the same way it began, with a single question that no one can answer. How could something like this happen, and how can it still be impossible to explain?